Well, thanks, Tom, for doing this little interview about your show, the Missing Pages. We're looking forward to this being part of our little Elora Festival on August the 8th.
I'm delighted. I'm really, really, really glad to be able to be part of things. Thanks.
Well, it's great to have this show. It's a fascinating story. Theodor Molt, a Canadian composer, the only one that we know of to have met the living legend Beethoven.
Right, exactly. That's it.
How did you find this?
Well, many years ago, probably close to 20 years ago, I regularly on my radio program on CBC, which was then CBC Radio 2, I would regularly tell stories about little-known composers, and I started thinking, well, there should be more Canadians. And I looked into the historical composers of Canada. And there are, a couple of really interesting stories. Calixa-Lavallée wrote "O Canada." His life story is an astonishing and amazing story. And there were a few others, but then I came across, and the way you've introduced it, this is the way we know Theodor Molt. He did many, many, many things. He lived a really interesting life, and he, I think, knew this would happen to a certain extent. He is the Canadian who met Beethoven, period. That's what it should, if he had business cards, that's what it would say.
That's what it would appear on it, yeah. Amazing. So this story, how did it sort of transpire over the generations since his death? What were his dates? Do you happen to know his dates off?
1795. He was born 1795.
Yeah.
The same year as Antoine Schindler, Beethoven's very unreliable, you could say fraudulent personal secretary.
Right.
And he died in the I'm remembering 1856. It was before the Civil War. 56, okay. I think.
Okay.
And therefore predeceasing Schindler by almost 15 years or so. And Schindler, I bring up because he's the narrator of The Missing Pages, our story. It's Schindler who tells the story.
Mm-hmm.
And Molt, just a sketch of his life. His dad was a Lutheran organist. He was born in Gschwend in Württemberg, near Stuttgart. He, at 18, went to university in Stuttgart to study math and humanities. And then midway through his first year, he was drafted by Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1813. Mm-hmm. So this is post the disastrous invasion of Russia, in which Napoleon's army was decimated, mm-hmm. But before Waterloo. And Molt was among a great number of 18-year-olds because Napoleon needed to rebuild his army. King Frederick of Württemberg had made a deal with Napoleon, which was, kind of what you did. It's sort of like making a deal with the mafia for a protection racket, actually. I mean,
oh, wow.
That's what comes to me. Napoleon's offer would be, would you like to join my army? And if you don't, I'm going to invade.
Right.
And so King Frederick had to decide which side he was on. And there's I can get lost in the details of this story. There's some interesting parallels there as well, because Württemberg was sort of the poor cousin of the German states, neighboring with Saxony and Bavaria, and always feeling a little bit like it wasn't being respected by these big brothers. Mm-hmm. And so Napoleon's offer to have them join was kind of a chance to get back at the big guys next door that never gave them the due they should. However, that proved to not be a very good plan, because within 6 months of Molt's being enlisted in the army, they had a disastrous loss in Leipzig, and then soon after that, the Waterloo debacle. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the story is we don't know when it came to Waterloo which side Molt was on, because by the time it got there, King Frederick of Württemberg had decided, this isn't working out, and he switched sides.
Yeah.
But Molt's, the only historical biography we have really is an obituary. It was written by a colleague and his Molt's boss when he died in 1856. He simply says that Molt was serving in Napoleon's army and was summoned to Waterloo, but his battalion was late. And therefore, that's why he survived, and that the scene of carnage he witnessed always stayed with him. So historically speaking, I don't know which side he was on, but he was lucky he got through it. That's for sure. And
just to run a parallel stream here, at at that period in history, 1813,
Yeah.
what was Beethoven up to in those days?
Right. So, well, I mean, around that time, that was post the invasion and occupation of Vienna, which was a major event in Beethoven's life.
Yeah.
There's stories of the cannonballs crashing through the roof of St. Stephen's Cathedral as Napoleon's army was attacking Vienna. All of the, how's this for leadership? All of the aristocracy left before he got there. Like the emperor, the whole bunch, they just left, and they left the gates to the armory open, saying, "Hi,
Help
how
yourself.
you doing? Yeah, come on in." And so, the scene of Napoleon's army coming into the gates of Vienna, it took more than 2 days for those soldiers to walk through. That's how many they were.
Oh my gosh!
It was just it's an unthinkable scene. So Beethoven had endured that. In addition to the occupation forces being there, it kind of messed up the the only performance of Fidelio. So he blamed the French occupation forces really for the failure, the relative failure of Fidelio, his opera. So Beethoven was very aware of these events. And 1813, he was entering what we'd call, I guess, the middle-late period of his compositional life.
Yep.
Bit of a fallow period. And one of the main events in this time of his life was the death of his brother, which resulted in that brother's son, Carl Beethoven, becoming, the subject of a very messy legal custody battle. Beethoven deeply, deeply desired an heir. He wanted someone to carry on his work. And he went to court to get custody of Carl from Carl's mother.
Yes, I remember the story, yeah.
And he claimed that she was morally unfit to be his mother. And I mean, it was a horrible, horrible case that went on for a very long time. And I'm sure that the only reason the court eventually granted Beethoven custody was that he was Beethoven. And by then already a very famous, as you said, actually, a living legend. He really was that. His story and his persona had gone so far that it was almost as if he wasn't really there anymore. So that's the background to Molt's encounter with Beethoven. There's Beethoven's concern over his son or his nephew, Carl. There's the fact that Antoine Schindler is involved or not involved in his life, and I can talk more about that. And at this point, when Molt, who had come to Canada in 1822. Now, once Molt had finished his hitch with Napoleon, I gather, I mean, again, this is something I just have to try to guess at. There probably weren't very many work opportunities. He was 8 years in the army, so that put him back quite a bit in terms of training and experience. He probably didn't have a competitive edge against other younger musicians.
Right.
In what was a busy Germany, it was a busy job market for an organist. And I think he must have answered some kind of trade journal because he came to Quebec City. He was the second professional musician in Lower Canada. He married the daughter of the first professional musician in Lower Canada, which they did. That actually was a kind of a pretty common arrangement in Germany of the time. You'd apprentice with some kind of a master tradesman and marry their daughter.
Well, it brings to mind Buxtehude in Lübeck.
Exactly.
The same situation, right? He shows up in Lübeck and marries his predecessor's daughter, and of course spends the rest of his life working at St. Mary's Church.
Yeah, that's it, and that's probably what the two. Glackmeyer was the first professional musician, also German-born. They probably had that kind of arrangement in mind. There's no documentation of it, but it is what happened. So he came there in 1822 and started life in Quebec City, which was a very prosperous, growing city at the time. It had already doubled in population in 10 years. And there was the new cathedral with a brand new organ and a sense that this was a land of promise and things were happening. And then 3 years later, 1825, Molt had some kind of identity crisis, I can only imagine, where he realized that if he wanted to have the career he dreamt of, that he needed more. And so he went back to Europe, which, a single transatlantic crossing in 1825 is taking your life in your hands. He did it in a total of 3 times. He went to Canada, then back, and then back home again. Yeah. But he spent a year and a half in Europe, and in the course of things, met and studied with Carl Czerny, who was Beethoven's most notable student at the time. Czerny would host these kind of piano gatherings in his home, and it was a place to meet other musicians. And Molt would have gone there. That's where he would have met Schindler, and eventually an audience with Beethoven resulted on December 13th. There were two afternoons, December 13th and 16th, 1825. And we know this because Beethoven was completely deaf at the time. The only way you could communicate with him was he always had a notebook in his pocket. In fact, the statue that's in the Vienna woods in Heiligenstadt, that you can see this statue of Beethoven, a big, huge figure, and there in his coat pocket is a notebook and pencil. So he would hand his notebook and pencil to you, and you would write your greetings, and he would shout his answers back to you. So these conversation books, there are 147 of them in the Beethoven Museum in Bonn. And they represent 10 years of the daily interactions from one of the world's greatest artists. It's kind of an incredible record. However, we know that Molt met him because there's a very florid, obsequious greeting from Theodor Molt to Beethoven. Humble greetings, Maestro Beethoven. And then the next 4 pages were ripped out at some subsequent point. And we don't know why. So they are the missing pages, and that's the story we try to tell.
The title of the work. Just to step back in time for a moment, Theodor Molt is in Lower Canada. He's come from Europe, of course, and likely brought with him ideas of and memories, thoughts of Beethoven, this genius composer. What do we know about how much of that music may have come with people from Europe, coming to the New World at the time? Was Beethoven sort of the household name here too, that he might have been in Europe, or was there a greater degree of separation and unfamiliarity?
That's a really interesting question. No one has asked me that before, but I think he must have been. I mean, Molt, I don't see Molt as he's a very sincere person. He really, from his actions, I don't think he was a manipulator or a charlatan or anything like that. But it's clear to me that, in a year and a half in Europe, moving around, he was in London, then Vienna, it's debatable how much actual study he could accomplish. Although certainly, a year and a half in a young musician's life, a lot can happen.
Sure. But
he was certainly aware that there was the career boost to being able to say that he'd met Beethoven. And I think that, I don't think he expressly went to Europe and spent a year and a half just hoping for that one afternoon, but clearly he knew that this was the most important thing that happened to him.
This would be an important thing to do. Yeah.
And it was just as, again, I keep mentioning Schindler, the charlatan, Schindler's business card, we joked about this, but Schindler's business card really did say Antoine Schindler, l'ami de Beethoven. Even though their friends was, there were times when they weren't exactly friends. Yeah. So that kind of thinking was out there. And I'm sure that Molt, once he had this opportunity to meet Beethoven, he recognized that it would have currency back home, which it did. He did quite well. It was a very hand-to-mouth existence at times, and he had to move around quite a bit. And he was navigating the politics of Lower Canada between French and English, then as now. He was a Lutheran organist in a Catholic city, right? Pretty much an Anglophone by comparison. Yeah. So that was a struggle, and that later in his life did result in some difficult circumstances. But despite that, it was clear that Beethoven was a known name. Now, as to how much of his music would have been heard in Quebec City, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I don't know whether Fur-Elise was the kind of known soundbite that it is now.
Right.
But certainly parlor music, if you look at the music written from Quebec musicians, including Molt at the time, the bulk of Lower Canada's musical life would have been singing, choirs, an occasional grand oratorio-like presentation, some of which he was involved with, and lots of parlor piano music played on spinets and smaller keyboards.
Entertainment, yeah.
So it's quite possible that, some of those Beethoven English songs, some of the smaller pieces,
Yeah.
I don't think a string quartet played, the Grosse Fugue in Quebec for a long time. I don't know that, but I suspect that it was more the populist kind of music.
Right.
Which does present another interesting question as to what does that mean? What is the actual contribution of a great artist in that situation?
Mm-hmm.
Was it just that we need someone to look up to? We need a hero. We need a name that we can say Beethoven and everybody go, oh, or was it really built on some kind of actual artistic understanding? I don't know.
Yeah. Lots of further questions that could be
tons, so much. Yeah, he lived this amazing life that opens so many doors.
Mm-hmm. So back to the notebook. There are 4 missing pages from this notebook that come immediately following Theodor Molt's introduction of himself to Beethoven.
Yeah.
Do we have any thought that all 4 of those belong to Molt, or that it could have been a variety of different things? And what happened to them? Are there other notebooks that are missing pages? And
yes, there are. So there's a number. The Schindler is. Antoine Schindler is both the hero and the villain of this story, of this history, because he ended up with the notebooks when Beethoven died. He and Beethoven were in a very stormy relationship. It's not kind to speak ill of the dead, even if they've been gone for that long. But the 2 of them were, oh my God, were a couple, to be sure. I can't even really think of the idea of being stuck in a dark, dusty, humid apartment with the 2 of them going at each other. Beethoven was, brilliant, but really difficult. Oh boy, he was. People talk about wanting to go back in time to have a meal with a famous figure. I wouldn't. Don't do that. I guess
someone else.
Yeah, because he was, in many ways, he was still living the life of, I don't want to say an adolescent, but a young man. Like he had these yearnings. He wanted to connect with other people. He never had a lasting romantic relationship. He was a terrible father to his forcefully adopted son, Carl. He was a really difficult man, and for good reason. He was completely isolated, but he also had a sense of himself as being an artistic prince, really. Like he knew that he was a great artist, and he knew that he referred
to himself as the Tondichter, right? The poet of sound.
Right, and that was we sort of take that for granted now because Beethoven built that model. But before Beethoven, there was nobody that would even imagine themselves. Not even Mozart. Mozart was just a humble servant who was misunderstood in his own. Well, maybe he was a little more than that. And Haydn became a star at the end of his life, a celebrity, but by then he'd spent 40 years as a servant, so it didn't change his ego.
Right.
But Beethoven really, from the beginning, or close to it, he famously said, there are many princes, there is one Beethoven. So and to be fair, he was right. There really was no one else like him.
That's right.
But as is true today with anyone else that asserts their power and their ego and their brilliance that much, there are all kinds of baggage. There's all kinds of baggage that comes along with that. So Antoine Schindler was the guy who was willing to carry that baggage, and it was not an easy journey. Schindler was the impresario effectively for the premiere of the Ninth Symphony in May of 1825. So that's 6 months before Molt met him. And Beethoven always felt that he was undercompensated for that performance, because it really was the famous ninth performance in Vienna was a moment of recognition for Beethoven. He was on stage with his back to the audience, buried in the score, hearing the music in his own mind because he couldn't hear anything else.
Right.
And by then it was already over, and the alto soloist tapped him on the shoulder, and he stood up and saw all Vienna cheering for him. This finally they know who I am. Amazing moment. Well, that wasn't enough. He also wanted to be paid what he thought was the right amount, and he felt that Schindler ripped him off. So he had banned Schindler from his presence completely at that point. But Schindler knew that his future, being l'ami de Beethoven, as he labeled himself, really was entwined with Beethoven's life. So he managed to get himself back into his good graces. And Schindler was there at the end of Beethoven's life. And although he was, as I understand, left out of Beethoven's will, he did end up with manuscript scores to the Ninth Symphony and the Missa Solemnis and all the conversation books and a whole bunch of letters and artifacts. And as soon as Beethoven was dead, he embarked on... Sorry?
So pots of gold, so to speak.
Yes, for sure.
What a legacy to be left with.
Yeah, and as soon as Beethoven was dead, he embarked on a career as a Beethoven expert, touring as a conductor and an advisor on performance practice. And about 13 years after Beethoven's death, he sold this treasure trove of artifacts to the Royal Berlin Museum for a big pile of money, as well as an annual salary. He was a salaried man for the rest of his life. And he published his own biography of Beethoven. I believe it's called My Life with Beethoven. And in this book, Antoine Schindler's role in Beethoven's life was far exaggerated. So, and as time was going on, the understanding of Beethoven's greatness was spreading far and wide, to the extent that another biographer, Alexander Wheelock Thayer, who was the librarian at Harvard University, took on the task, which proved to be his life's work, of writing an authoritative scholarly biography of Beethoven. And as soon as Schindler sold those papers to the library in Berlin, he made them available to others, which meant the clock was ticking on his own highly falsified account of Beethoven's life and his involvement in it.
Right.
So Thayer is quietly, studiously putting this story together and comparing it to Schindler's and saying, "Oh, hang on a minute.
Not quite the same story."
No. And so we know that Schindler went back to because of Thayer's work, we know Schindler went back to the conversation books. And remember, Beethoven's words never appear. It's just other people. Right. So if Schindler found a blank page, which was often the case in these conversation books, he would write something in, let's say, 1828. Yeah. He would write something that happened supposedly in May of 1817.
Oh my God.
In which he would say, "Maestro, how nice to see you. Thank you for your compliments on my symphony," or whatever. And then he'd write that into his book. He's completely fraudulent.
Wow.
So historians, and then he also doctored these books quite a bit, took out some things that he thought were to make him look bad. No doubt the fight over the ninth, he didn't leave that in there.
Oh, for sure.
So historians are left with this very interesting puzzle where, on one hand, this man, he defiled the historical record by altering these books. And on the other hand, if he hadn't been so invested in them, we wouldn't have them at all.
Right.
Beethoven wouldn't have cared about these books. He would have just chucked them.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. So that is what we know about the conversation books so far. And by the way, Thayer's Life of Beethoven was published just after Schindler's death. So Schindler made it to the finish line without being called out as a fraud. and it's in Thayer's biography that we get with the one little reliable fact about Theodor Molt's life. Remember, Thayer was either in Boston or in Italy, where he was living, writing the story. So he went from Boston up to Burlington, Vermont, where Molt had settled for the last 10 years of his life, to meet Molt and ask him about meeting Beethoven. And he missed him by 6 months. He got there too late. Molt was dead. But he did talk to Molt's sons. And because it's a secondhand account, it isn't included in the main body of the biography, but it is a footnote. There you go. That's the best we can do, Mark, is become a footnote in the biography of a great artist.
What do we know about Molt after he met Beethoven and then made the third treacherous trip across the Atlantic and came back to?
He came back to Quebec City and established. He had already established a quite a busy teaching studio, and he ran the Juvenile Harmonic Society, a kids' choir, I assume. He went back and forth between Quebec and Montreal. He published quite a bit. There are a few treatises, educational treatises, and he invented something, which I'm a chronometer, I think it's called. I don't know. It's some kind of metronome-like thing. I don't know. It's written up in his biography, but I don't know what it is. If anybody has one, please let me know.
Wonder if that has any connection to Beethoven,
Yeah, I don't think so. That's an interesting thought. It's true. Beethoven had a thing with the metronome. Yeah, I don't know what this invention is, but he invented it. He published a fair amount of music, and did quite well. He and Henriette, his wife, had a number of children. But as I was mentioning earlier, the politics of Lower Canada eventually caught up with him in a very brutal way in 1846. So that's less than a decade after the Papineau rebellions.
Yeah.
There was a fire at the Théâtre Saint-Louis in Quebec City. That's how in Quebec, and I imagine in North America, it became standard to have doors that open out. These doors opened in, and there was a fire, and people were trapped, and many people died, including Molt's wife, Henriette, and two of their sons.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, he, I can only assume, went into a period of grief. About a year later, he remarried a woman from the Anglican congregation, Harriet Cowan,
mm-hmm.
and this was apparently too much for the Quebec City Cathedral congregation. The fact that he had married an Anglican, and that he wasn't really a French Canadian anyway,
right.
And they sort of dismissed him on what seemed to me pretty clearly trumped up reasons, mm-hmm. and he was replaced with a French Canadian organist within a few weeks. So that would have been a pretty awful time, mm-hmm. having lost his family or part of his family, and then losing his job. But he was a pioneer. He was, I think his life attests pretty clearly that he was a man who was willing to carry on and do whatever had to be done. Right. So he went to Montreal, and he'd been to Vermont prior to that. He ended up in Burlington, Vermont, teaching at what was called the Burlington Female Seminary. It was the only school, the first school in the state teaching women about music. It was connected to the Baptist congregation there, and John K. Converse was the pastor of this church and also his employer at the school. And it's through Converse that we know much of what we know about his life. When he died in 1856, Converse wrote this very nice obituary. And there's one other little really tantalizing fact, which I'm eventually going to get around to finishing a book about this because it's so fascinating to me. The church where John K. Converse was minister, the Baptist Church in Burlington, and where it was connected to the seminary, was one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad. And there was a tunnel from the church to the school under the road. Wow. So they would use this church as a destination point and then spirit slaves under the tunnel and then get them down to Lake Champlain, where they'd be taken by boat up into Canada.
Wow.
And so in 1856, when Molt died, that's 6 years before the Civil War, there were no doubt bounty hunters around. They would have known that Burlington was one of the destination places, sure. and there was money to be made recapturing slaves. So here we have this picture of Theodor Molt, the friendly old grandpa in his dotage teaching in a quiet, retired life, although there were slaves being smuggled in the tunnel under the road. And as somebody who fought for Napoleon and who wasn't afraid of traversing the Atlantic, there's no way he wasn't involved.
Yeah.
But that's
that would be, to know more about that. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah, it is an amazing life. He really, I really admire him, and he is an example to me of I mean, we've joked about the best we can do is to be a footnote in history, but that's kind of true. Mm-hmm. And for Molt to have lived such an engaged and interesting life and to be so spirited and so positive and so energetic about it is really, it's deeply inspiring.
Incredible.
There's one more thing.
Yeah.
A violinist in Kitchener, Peter Carter, plays in the symphony. He and I were in the youth orchestra together a million years ago. He got in touch with me recently because his mom's family is related to Henriette, Theodor's wife, first wife.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the Bignell family. Yeah. And Peter recently visited with his grandma, who has the family tree that his grandpa put together he has a bunch of Molt's publications. And Peter and I have known each other since 1985, and this is the first I knew of that. So that was kind of exciting.
Oh, that's so cool! What an incredible connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So tell us now a little bit about your production. You've taken this story as the basis of the missing pages, and where do we pick up the story, and where does it take us?
Right. So the story starts as Molt is arriving in Vienna on his European sojourn, and it takes place entirely in those 2 days that he met Beethoven. Its setting is Beethoven's apartment.
Yeah.
And just technically, the way we did this, it was in June. There are 5 of us in the production, and social distancing was important. We know that singing could be dangerous,
Sure.
So we had to film in a way that we were all safe. So Greg Sinclair, my colleague who was with CBC radio drama for many years, and then at Soul Pepper Theater, he directed this, and he's done an unbelievable job of assembling these 5 disparate images. And when we did it, I pictured it to look like the Zoom chat we're having now, people in different windows. But Greg's been able to manipulate the backgrounds that there are moments where, I see myself talking with or singing along with Bryce Kulak, and I'm saying to myself, "Hey, back up! You're too close." But we were in different rooms,
buildings, right? Yeah. Oh, wow.
So it's an amazing job that he did. So yeah, we filmed there are 5 of us. Pardon me. There are 5 of us. There's myself. I play Schindler. Bryce Kulak is Theodor Molt. Laurie Gemmel, my wife, harpist and Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, is kind of like the equivalent of the sound effects person for an old radio drama, although she's offering musical illustration throughout for the fun. And Derek Boyes plays Beethoven, brilliantly so. And then Patricia O'Callaghan plays a character named Susanna Soto. Now, what we know from the footnote in Thayer's Life of Beethoven is that the family story, as told by Molt's sons, was that Molt arrived at Beethoven's studio on December 13th, 1825, and Beethoven at the time was completely infatuated with a singer who had just visited to pay her tributes to the great maestro. And he only wanted to write love poetry that would win her heart. And he enlisted Molt to help him in this regard, and that Molt reported that the poetry was pretty bad. so that's the only real, if it is a fact, it's a sort of a shadow of a fact that we have about what happened between them. So Susanna Soto is that female singer, and Trish played her.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So this, of course, was meant to be a live stage production, right?
Yes.
Originally, and the pandemic comes around, and so you have to shift into this new format. Did you have to change much of the content of the show to make this work now? In the new configuration?
No, it's interesting. It's a good question. You'd think I would have had to, but not really. It really already functioned in a way that's quite convenient for this format. Somewhere between a staged play and an audio drama. So you'll see the actors are not hiding that we're reading a script as a radio drama would.
Yeah.
But we're still also occupying those characters, and there's a certain amount of movement. It's actually a pretty accurate representation of the stage production.
Okay. Yeah. And quite amazing that you could accomplish.
Yeah. I didn't know that when I wrote this that I was creating something that would work in a pandemic, but I guess I was lucky.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's incredible. Tell me about the music in it. Is there Beethoven's music in it?
Yes, quite a bit. Yeah, there are a couple of larger pieces. There's a segment from the middle of the Grosse Fuge, which he was transcribing for piano 4 hands at the time. That was how it's interesting, even though there had been so much change in European life and the role of the artist, as we've said, had changed dramatically. The way they made money had not changed since Mozart or Haydn's time. So Beethoven would put on a performance of a big piece like the Opus 130 string quartet with the Grosse Fuge in it, and make probably not very much money at all. And then the money would be earned when immediately after they could create an arrangement for home use of this now notorious music. So the Grosse Fuge got the most attention because it was so outrageously contemporary, and people wanted to hear it. And of course, at the performance, the premiere performance, there might have been, 30, 40 people, I'm guessing, there. But there were hundreds who would like to buy this music. So Beethoven had to get, as Mozart did before him, had to get the arrangements done really quickly and get it out there to make the money, because there was no copyright. Somebody else could easily do that.
Yeah.
So that's what he was actively working on when Molt stopped by. So we have the middle section of the Grosse Fuge, a number of piano sonata segments arranged either for harp, Laurie plays them on harp, or harp and piano, or in some cases all of us are performing. There's one of his songs, To the Distant Beloved. Let's see, what else? There's some original music. Bryce and Trish and I each wrote some songs that sort of, in the way of musical theater, advance the story and tell us a bit about the character's life. Yeah, that's about it. There's a couple of movements of Cpe Bach. This is a bit of a leap on my part, but it seems to me that Cpe Bach was kind of the leader for Beethoven, the one who kind of led the way in terms of abrupt tonal shifts. And at the time, in the mid 1700s, there was this very big priority placed on introductions and smoothness of transition, as if the audience was not really capable of absorbing these kind of rough cuts. If you think of it in terms of like television today, we don't spend time preparing the audience for shifts in narrative now. It just happens because we know that that's how life is and we can deal with it. Beethoven did that. There were times when Beethoven there's just no introduction. That's right. And I think to a certain extent, he got that from Cpe Bach. Cpe Bach's, in a very 18th century way, he was kind of brutal, beautifully brutal and surprising. So there are a couple of pieces of his which we inserted because they, to my mind anyway, they pay tribute to Beethoven in a weird way.
An aspect of music history that I love, and it doesn't get a lot of attention when you study music history or you teach music history. We're conditioned to sort of get right to the business, right? Here's Beethoven's fifth, here's Beethoven's sixth and the ninth, and all of these kinds of things, and we don't really spend a whole lot of time in the context of their lives as human beings. I just am so intrigued and so fascinated by what was the day-to-day grind like for these people. What did they do? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? All of these sort of human things, the kinds of interactions, and this interaction with Theodor Molt, having a Canadian connection, of course, is just one of those sort of aspects. To Beethoven it was a footnote, but to Molt it was probably the defining moment of his life in some ways.
I agree. And for us, the smaller interactions are the things that teach us a lot about what life was really like. So the idea that somebody would travel all that way and just arrive, Beethoven doesn't know who he is. There's no email ahead of time. He just arrives, this guy from some place that Beethoven's probably never heard of. Yeah. And they have this interaction. And so Beethoven also, in addition to so many other things, he really was among the first celebrity artists. So where Haydn was a celebrity in London, Beethoven was a legendary name, but he also had no time for celebrity culture. He was disgusted by it. Mm-hmm. And if he perceived somebody to be a sort of a fame hunter, he would just dismiss them out of hand. Yeah. So that Molt, in the same way that Molt gained some career advantage by being able to legitimately say that he met Beethoven, or I think he probably said that he studied with Beethoven, which was not really true. Beethoven would have been intrigued by the idea that this person had come so far and that his life was so bizarrely different than his own. I know it's really something. There are all these little details. I recently came across one that I love. Beethoven's copyist was an old man who lived in a former nail forge, like a blacksmith shop that used to make nails, under the gates, one of the gates to Vienna. So there are these big round stone wall, the wall and the gates, which were still there during Beethoven's life. And there was a little shop on the inside of the stone wall, and that's where Beethoven's copyist lived. So can you imagine this poor soul hunched over with fumes of blacksmith shops around, handed this chicken scratch, this insanely messy manuscript by this monstrously impatient, difficult man, and expected to make sense of it? I mean, there's a moment for you in a life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So many untold stories.
Yeah.
Incredible. Well, I can't wait to see this. I think the story is just incredibly fascinating to know of this Canadian and the effort and work that he took to meet Beethoven and the idea of what might be in those 4 missing pages. That it's sort of left up to us to imagine, but. Really a fascinating story, and we're, I think, very grateful to you, Tom, for finding it and bringing it to our attention through this.
As I've said before, I'm thrilled. I certainly did not plan on making a video of it this way, but I'm really glad that we did, and I'm delighted that the Elora Festival's including it, and I hope it leads to more collaboration in the future. Absolutely. Likewise. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And August the 8th is the day of the performance of the missing pages. And we can't wait to see the story. All right. Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much, Tom.